Good morning. On the 10th Sunday after Trinity, the readings are Matthew 14:22-33 and 1 Kings 19:9-18. Encouragement through God's presence in the way He manifests Himself to us may be the theme of today's readings. In 1 Kings chapter 19, the threat of bad Queen Jezebel to kill all the prophets in the land had prompted Elijah to run for his life, and we find him after a long journey spending the night in a cave. Then the Lord speaks to him, asking him what he is doing there. Elijah has something to say about that. His life has been threatened, even though he has been faithful in his work for the Lord. In other words, there's a bit of a moan from Elijah, indicating that it's all been for no good at all, and now he's on the run. Surely the Lord should understand how difficult it all is. But God tells him simply to stand on the mountain before the Lord and see how the Lord is to pass by. This was a big thing, reminding us of Moses on the mountain when the Lord passed by him. Here too, Elijah is experiencing the Lord coming close, but it is not in the strong wind that broke rocks in pieces, nor is the Lord in the earthquake that followed, or even in the fire. After all those, there was a sound of sheer silence, more ominous than anything that had been felt and heard before. And Elijah responds by wrapping his face in his mantle while standing at the entrance of the cave. Here again the Lord speaks to him, asking a second time what Elijah is doing there, and then tells him what he is to do. It is interesting that we read about a strong wind in Matthew's passage from chapter 14 too. The boat in which the disciples were sailing during the night was battered by the waves, for the wind was against them. Then early in the morning Jesus came towards them, walking on the water, and the disciples were terrified, thinking he was a ghost. We may have a question about those events. If God is not in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but he is in the silence, which is more powerful than any of those noisy forces of nature, then what does that tell us about Jesus when he walks on the water, even while the wind is raging around him? Possibly just this, that Jesus, as God's Son, has dominion over nature, and that his walking is effortless, unhindered by any storm. Looking at the two readings, what do we find? We find Elijah and the disciples in tricky circumstances. They know the Lord. Elijah through his ministry as a prophet, with experience of God's wonderful provision and care, and the disciples have come to know Jesus' power quite well too. Yet for any of them, the prophet and the disciples, it was hard to put their trust fully in God when the tide changed, literally in the disciples' case. Several of the disciples were professional fishermen, but even they were struggling to keep the boat on track against the wind. How then does all this work for us in our present situation at both the personal and the global level? I suppose that we, in our present day, can be happy about all the technical and scientific developments that have been achieved. We can send people to the moon. We know how to construct machines for war, and we are learning more and more about the way nature works. But all these inventions have not taught us how to make peace for all, how to put an end to hunger, and how to be healers of the soul. If there is any place where we can begin to learn these things, it should be with a renewed understanding of who God is. Once we know how to recognize and value God's power and His love and care for the world, yes, even with all its tricky human beings, then we may begin to feel encouraged to bring His love and healing to others. When we know how much He has done for us, we can be empowered to share Him. We may not walk on water, but as disciples of Christ, we may walk in the right direction, as Peter did when he stepped out of the boat, as long as we keep our eyes on Jesus Himself and trust Him enough to take His hand and His word. Amen.